If your tax bracket will be lower in retirement, use the 401k. If it will be higher, use the Roth. That single sentence is the most repeated piece of retirement advice in America, printed in brokerage brochures, recited by advisors, embedded in the default logic of nearly every online calculator. It is clean, it is symmetric, and for the saver retiring in 1995, it was very close to correct. The rule rests on one number: your marginal tax bracket, now versus later. Money going into a traditional 401k is deducted from today's taxable income and taxed when it comes out. Money going into a Roth is taxed today and comes out untouched. So the whole decision, the rule insists, collapses into a single comparison. Pay the tax at whichever rate is lower. If you expect to earn less in retirement, which almost everyone did, you defer. Take the deduction now at a high rate and pay later at a low one. For decades, that expectation held for a specific structural reason. The retiree of the 1980s and 1990s often walked out of a career with a defined benefit pension, a guaranteed monthly check based on final salary. Stack that pension on top of Social Security and 401k withdrawals, and it was still, for most, a step down from peak working income. Lower income in retirement meant a lower bracket. The rule matched the world. Then the arithmetic underneath it moved. Consider the median full-time worker today. Bureau of Labor Statistics figures put median weekly earnings for full-time wage and salary workers at roughly $1.170 in 2024. Call it about $60,000 a year. That worker almost certainly has no pension. The defined benefit plan, which covered the majority of private sector workers with retirement coverage in the late 1970s, now covers a small and shrinking slice. The three-legged stool lost a leg, and nobody rebalanced the rule that assumed all three legs were there. Here is the flat claim this video will defend. The standard bracket comparison rule has been quietly mispriced, not wrong in its logic, wrong in its inputs. It still asks you to compare today's bracket to a retirement bracket, but it silently assumes today's brackets stay put, assumes the standard deduction stays small, and assumes a pension fills the gap. All three assumptions have a date stamp, and all three have expired or are about to. The consequence is not academic. For the median saver, the account the old rule points to, and the account that actually leaves more spendable money at 65 have come apart, and in a direction most people are not expecting. The saver who dutifully follows the sentence in the brochure may be handing the government a larger share of a smaller pile. Which raises the only question worth the next 40 minutes. For a concrete saver, a real income, a real contribution, a real horizon, which account leaves more money after the tax collector has taken his cut? And why did the honest answer to that question change? The rule everyone still repeats was built for a specific set of tax brackets, a specific deduction, and a specific kind of retiree. That rule assumes a world that stopped existing on a specific date. Before the rule is dismantled, it deserves an honest defense, because it was not born stupid, it was born accurate. For a large stretch of the 20th century, comparing your bracket now to your bracket later was not a lazy heuristic. It was the correct reduction of a real problem, and the savers who followed it walked into retirement with exactly the outcome it promised. Understanding why demands looking at the machinery that made it true, not the slogan it decayed into. Start with the deeper logic. Tax deferral is only a good trade when the rate you skip today is higher than the rate you pay tomorrow. That is the entire game. Every dollar routed into a traditional plan is a bet that your future self stands in a lower bracket than your present self. In a world engineered to make that bet win almost automatically, deferral was close to a free lunch, and the rules simply described the free lunch. Now the parallel that makes the point sharpest. In 1974, Congress passed ERISA, the law that governs private pensions. At that moment, the defined benefit pension was the spine of American retirement. A worker at a manufacturer, a utility, a bank could expect a guaranteed monthly check keyed to final salary and years of service. That check was predictable, it was employer-funded, and this is the part the rule quietly leaned on. It was usually smaller than the paycheck it replaced. Consider a composite worker from that era, a plant supervisor retiring in 1988 after 30 years, final salary around $42,000. His pension might replace 50 to 60% of that roughly $23,000 a year. Add Social Security, and his taxable income in retirement landed well below his working peak. During his career, he was taxed on income near the top of his personal ladder. In retirement, he was taxed near the bottom. Deferring made unambiguous sense. Take the deduction at a high working rate, withdraw at a low retirement rate, pocket the spread. That spread was the whole return, and the structure of his life guaranteed it. He did not have to forecast tax policy or model bracket changes. The pension mechanically produced a lower retirement income, the deduction mechanically produced an upfront saving, and the gap between the two was money in his pocket. The rule worked because the world was rigged in its favor. And it was not only the pension. The tax code of that period stacked far more brackets far more steeply. In 1980, the top marginal federal rate was 70%, and even a middle manager could sit in a bracket that made the upfront deduction genuinely valuable. High working rates plus a guaranteed lower retirement income is the exact soil in which bracket comparison thrives. Both blades of the scissors were sharp. The application, in that world, was almost trivial. A worker with a pension coming, taxed heavily today, could defer with confidence and be right. The rule was not convenient fiction. It was a faithful map of a specific territory. The people who wrote it into brochures were not fools. They were describing the retirement their own parents were living through. This matters because the temptation, once a rule is exposed as outdated, is to decide it was always nonsense. It was not. It was engineering that matched its era. The plant supervisor who deferred was rewarded precisely as promised, richer at 65 for having listened. Which is what makes the present moment so treacherous. The rule did not fail because its logic rotted. Its logic is intact. It failed because the inputs it depends on, the high working brackets, the low retirement income, the pension underneath it all, have each quietly slid out from under it. The map is still elegant, the territory is gone. Every assumption that made the rule work has since moved. Before the tax debate is even worth having, there is a return sitting on the table that the entire Roth versus traditional argument never touches, and getting the order wrong forfeits it permanently. Here is the claim, stated flatly. For most workers with a workplace plan, the first dollar of the decision has nothing to do with tax brackets. It has to do with the employer match. And the match is not a tax question. It is a compensation question wearing a retirement account costume. Watch the mechanism because this is where the framing everyone uses quietly breaks. The Roth versus traditional debate is a debate about when you pay tax on your own money, today or later. That is the whole axis. But the match is not your money being taxed at one point or another. It is additional money, contingent on your contributing at all. A common structure is a 50% match on the first 6% of salary. Contribute 6%. The employer adds 3. That 3% is not a rate of return in the market sense. It is an instantaneous, guaranteed 50-cent gain on every dollar, credited before a single day of compounding, before any market movement, before any tax treatment enters the picture. Set that against the thing savers agonize over. The traditional versus Roth gap, for a median earner, is a spread measured in a handful of percentage points of eventual tax rate. Real, worth solving, but bounded. The match is a 50% return on contributed dollars, upfront, risk-free. No security in the public markets offers that. No bracket arbitrage strategy comes near it. The saver deepened forum threads comparing marginal rates to the second decimal place, while declining to contribute enough to capture the full match, is optimizing the small lever and ignoring the large one. Now deepen it, because the contrast is starker than a single year suggests. Consider a composite saver earning $60,000, offered that 50% match on the first 6%. Full capture means $3,600 of her own money and $1,800 from the employer every year. Skip to the tax question first. Decide she prefers a Roth IRA and root her savings there instead of the plan. A genuine mistake people make because the Roth feels optimized, and she leaves that $1,800 on the table annually. Over a 30-year horizon, before any growth, that is $54,000 in forfeited compensation. Let it compound at 7% inside the plan. and the abandoned match alone approaches $180,000 by 65. That figure dwarfs the entire traditional versus Roth dollar gap this video is building toward. This is the part the tribal debate structurally cannot see. Both camps argue about the tax treatment of the account. Neither argument reaches the match, because the match is upstream of the account type entirely. A traditional 401k and a Roth 401k, inside the same plan, typically receive the same match. The employer does not care which bucket you choose. It cares that you contribute, so the match sits outside the fight, untouched by whoever wins it. Which reframes the real first question. It is not traditional or Roth. That question is second, and it is smaller than its volume suggests. The real first question is, are you contributing enough to capture every matched dollar available to you? For anyone who is not, the tax treatment debate is a rounding error argued over the top of a much larger loss. The order matters, and most decision procedures skip it. They open with the bracket comparison, the interesting part, the part with a clever answer, and treat the match as an afterthought, if they mention it at all. But arithmetic does not reward the interesting question, it rewards the large one first. Before the tax question matters at all, there is a return you forfeit by getting the order wrong. The rule assumed a world with a fixed set of tax brackets. That world had an expiration date printed on it, December 31st, 2025, and almost nobody following the rule has read it. Start with the tax code itself, because that is where the clearest date lives. In December 2017, Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Effective January 2018, it lowered most individual marginal rates. The bracket that had been 25% became 22%. The 28% bracket became 24%. The 15% bracket became 12%. For the median earner, the rate charged on the top slice of income dropped by roughly 3 points overnight. That is the exact opposite of the high bracket environment the plant supervisor deferred against in 1988. But the law did something unusual with these cuts. It did not make them permanent. To fit the legislation inside the Senate's budget rules, the individual rate reductions were written to sunset to expire at the end of 2025. Absent new legislation, on January 1, 2026, the brackets revert to their pre-2018 schedule. The 22% bracket climbs back toward 25. The 24% bracket climbs back toward 28. The dates are in the statute, not in a forecast. Hold both dates in view at once, because the comparison is the whole point. The saver deferring income today does so at 22 or 24%. The old rule tells her she will withdraw at a lower rate in retirement. But the rates she is deferring against are themselves scheduled to rise for everyone. She is not comparing a high working bracket to a low retirement bracket. She may be comparing an artificially low working bracket to a retirement bracket set by a schedule that resets upward. The scissors the rule relied on has one blade pointing the wrong way. Now the second moving input, the standard deduction. Before 2018, a single filer's standard deduction was $6.350. The 2017 law nearly doubled it, and indexing has carried it further, roughly $15,000 for a single filer in 2025, near $30,000 for a married couple. That is not a footnote. It means the first $30,000 a retired couple pulls from a traditional account can be shielded before a dollar of tax is owed, then taxed at 10 and 12% on the way up. The old rule, written when the deduction was small, systematically overstates the retirement tax bill on traditional withdrawals. It penalizes deferral for a cost that shrank. These two changes cut in opposite directions, and that is exactly why the arithmetic became subtle rather than obvious. Rising future brackets argue against deferral. A larger deduction argues for it. The old rule accounts for neither. It froze both inputs at their 1990s values. Then the third change, the structural one, already named but now dated. In the late 1970s, defined benefit pensions covered the majority of private sector workers who had any retirement coverage at all. By the 2010s, that share had collapsed into the low double digits and kept falling. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that as of 2023, Only about 15% of private industry workers had access to a defined benefit plan. The guaranteed check that mechanically produced a lower retirement income, the very thing that made deferral a near-automatic win, is gone for most people entering retirement now. So line the eras up side by side. The 1988 retiree, high working bracket, small deduction, pension underneath, low taxable retirement income. Deferral wins cleanly. The 2025 saver, historically low working bracket scheduled to rise, a large deduction, no pension, and retirement income drawn almost entirely from her own accounts. Every input the rule depends on has moved, and 2 of them have moved against it. This is what answers the question left standing. The old rule was not convenient fiction. It was a faithful map of high brackets, small deductions, and guaranteed pensions. It was right for its territory, and it was right for a reason. It stopped being right when each of those 3 inputs changed, on dates you can look up. With those dates on the table, the arithmetic no longer points where the rule says. So who exactly is standing at this fork? Not an abstraction. A person with a paycheck, a contribution rate, and a number of years left to work. Until the saver is concrete, the argument stays a debate. Once she has a name on the spreadsheet, it becomes arithmetic. Consider Diane. She is 40 years old, single, and earns $72,000 a year working in hospital administration in a state with a modest income tax. She has no pension. None was ever offered. Her employer sponsors a plan with a 50% match on the first 6% of salary, and she already contributes enough to capture all of it, so the match question is settled and off the table. What remains unsettled is the question this whole video circles. Of the dollars she saves beyond the match, should they go into the traditional side of her plan, taking the deduction now, or into a Roth, paying the tax now and never again? Her 2025 marginal bracket is 22%. That is the rate the old rule tells her to defer against. She plans to retire at 65, a 25-year horizon. She can direct $8,000 a year of her own money into one bucket or the other. Assume a 7% nominal return, held constant across both paths, so the account type, not the market, is what moves the outcome. Everything else about Diane is held identical. Same income, same savings, same market. The only variable is the tax wrapper. Here is why she is the right case rather than a convenient one. Diane sits almost exactly where the 2 moving inputs collide. Her 22% bracket is one of the rates scheduled to revert upward after December 2025. Her single filer's standard deduction, roughly $15,000 in 2025, is large enough to shield the first slice of any traditional withdrawal she takes later. She has no pension to stack income on top of, which means in retirement her taxable income is whatever she chooses to withdraw, and not a dollar more. She is not an edge case built to prove a point. She is close to the median of the people the old rule is still being recited to. The lesson embedded in choosing her is quiet, but it matters. Every rule of thumb hides its assumptions inside a phantom person. The bracket comparison rule assumes someone with high working income, a pension underneath, and a small deduction, the plant supervisor from 1988. Diane is that phantom's replacement, and she breaks the assumptions one at a time. Lower working bracket than the rule imagines, no pension, a deduction 3 times larger. When you swap the real person in for the phantom, the rule's clean answer stops being obviously clean. And that is precisely where the danger sits. The rule still returns an answer for Diane, instantly, confidently. Compare 22% now to her expected retirement bracket, assume the second number is lower, defer. The sentence in the brochure does not hesitate. It has no mechanism to notice that the inputs beneath it have shifted, because it was never designed to check its own assumptions. It just runs. So let the confident answer sit there for a moment unexamined, the way it sits in most people's heads. The rule says defer. The traditional 401k wins. Diane takes the deduction at 22% today and pays a lower rate tomorrow. The only honest way to test that is to stop reciting and start calculating. 2 identical savers, 2 buckets, 1 difference. When you run the real dollars, the deduction, the growth, the tax on the way out, the deduction on the way out, Does the gap the rule promises survive contact with the numbers, or does it invert? Now the two paths can be run dollar for dollar. Follow Diane down the traditional road first and watch the number the old rule is quietly proud of. $8,000 a year routed into the traditional side of her plan grows untouched by tax for 25 years. At 7%, an $8,000 annual contribution compounds to roughly $506,000 by the time she turns 65. That is the figure the brochure points at. It is large, it is clean, and it is the number that makes deferral feel like the obvious winner. $500,000 built from $200,000 of her own contributions and $306,000 of growth she never paid a dime of tax on along the way. But that number hides two things, and both of them matter. The first is the deduction Diane collected every year on the way in. Because her $8,000 went in pre-tax at a 22% marginal bracket, she was never actually out $8,000 of take-home pay. The traditional contribution reduced her tax bill by $1,760 each year, 22% of $8,000. An honest comparison cannot let that money vanish. If Diane is disciplined, she does not spend it. She reinvests it. That reinvested tax saving is the traditional path's real edge, and the old rule leans on it, without ever saying so out loud. So run it properly. That $1,760 a year, invested in a taxable brokerage account at the same 7%, but taxed along the way on dividends and eventual gains, because a taxable account is not tax-free, grows to somewhere near $95,000 to $105,000 by 65, depending on turnover and the drag from annual taxation. Call it $100,000 as a round, illustrative figure. The traditional path, done correctly, is not one pot. It is two, a $506,000 pre-tax 401k, and roughly $100,000 in a side account funded entirely by the deductions. Add them, and the traditional saver appears to be sitting on about $606,000 at 65. That is a commanding-looking total, and it is exactly the total the old rule wants you to stop at. Defer, take the deduction, reinvest it, retire rich. The arithmetic looks settled. Here is the second thing the headline number hides, and it is the larger one. The $506,000 inside the 401k is a pre-tax balance. Every dollar of it, every contribution, every year of growth is still owed to the tax collector. Diane has not paid income tax on any of it yet. She merely postponed the bill. When she withdraws in retirement, each dollar lands on her return as ordinary income, taxed at whatever the schedule says then, after her standard deduction shields the first slice. That is the quiet distortion in comparing a traditional balance to a Roth balance side by side. The two numbers are denominated in different currencies. A Roth dollar is spendable. A traditional dollar is a claim the government has not yet cashed. To compare them honestly, the traditional balance has to be run through the tax the old rule assumes will be low, and that assumption is precisely the one the 2026 reversion and the shifting deduction have made unstable. The old rule's whole case rests on the size of that future haircut. If Diane's retirement bracket really is lower than 22%, the haircut is small and deferral wins. If the brackets she deferred against have quietly reverted upward, and her account is large enough to push withdrawals past the sheltered slice, the haircut grows, and the $506,000 shrinks toward a spendable figure nobody put on the brochure. So the traditional path leaves Diane with the bigger headline number. On that, the old rule is correct. $606,000 across two pots looks like victory. But the pre-tax balance looks larger precisely because part of it was never hers. That number is not yours yet. Now run Diane down the Roth road and hold every other variable exactly where it was, because that is the only way to see what the tax wrapper actually does. Same $8,000 a year, same 7%, same 25 years. But there is a difference on the way in that the side-by-side comparison usually smuggles past you. Diane's $8,000 into a Roth is $8,000 of after-tax money. To put $8,000 into the Roth, she first earned it, then paid her 22%, then contributed what remained. There is no deduction, no $1,760 rebate to reinvest. The Roth path has one pot, not two. and it is funded with dollars that have already been to the tax collector and come back clean. So the Roth balance grows to the same figure the traditional account did, roughly $506,000 by 65. Identical contributions, identical return, identical arithmetic of compounding. But here is the central truth the whole comparison has been circling. That $506,000 on the Roth is spendable. Every dollar of it is Diane's. There is no future claim against it, no ordinary income tax waiting at withdrawal, no haircut the old rule assumes will be gentle. The number on the statement is the number she can spend. Set the two paths beside each other and unfold them slowly, because this is where the rule of thumb quietly loses. The traditional path, done honestly, was two pots, a $506,000 pre-tax 401k plus roughly $100,000 in the side account funded by reinvested deductions. Headline total, about $606,000. The Roth path is one pot of $506,000, fully spendable. On the surface, the traditional saver looks $100,000 richer. But now cash the government's claim, which is the step the brochure never takes. Diane's $506,000 traditional balance is pre-tax. Draw it down in retirement, and it lands as ordinary income. Give her the most generous version of the old rule's promise. A low retirement bracket, her standard deduction shielding the first slice, and the effective tax on those withdrawals still runs somewhere around 12 to 15%, once the account is large enough to push past the sheltered layer. Apply even 13% to $506,000 and roughly $66,000 evaporates. The spendable value of the traditional 401k falls to about $440,000. Add back the side account. The $100,000 and the taxable brokerage has embedded capital gains. Liquidating it costs perhaps $12,000 to $15,000 in long-term gains tax. Call the spendable value $86,000. Total spendable on the traditional path, roughly $526,000. Now the comparison is finally denominated in the same currency. Both saved identically. Both grew identically. Roth spendable at 65, $506,000. Traditional spendable at 65, about $526,000. The gap is not the commanding $100,000 the headline promised. It is roughly $20,000, and it survives only if the retirement bracket lands low, exactly as the old rule assumes. That is the answer to the question left standing 3 blocks ago. When you run the real dollars, the gap does not vanish, but it collapses from 100,000 to 20, and it hangs entirely on one assumption the schedule has made shaky. Move Diane's retirement effective rate up a few points toward what a reverted bracket schedule and a larger account produce, and that thin $20,000 traditional lead does not just shrink. The spendable gap at 65 is not where the rule of thumb predicted, and it is pointing the other way sooner than anyone reciting the sentence expects. The skeptic could stop the recalculation right here and land a fair blow. $20,000, the objection goes, is a rounding error across a quarter century. Even if a reverted bracket schedule flips the lead, the two paths end up close enough that the whole exercise looks like accountants arguing over a rounding line. Pick either account, contribute diligently, and you arrive at roughly the same place. The balance is the balance. Take that objection seriously, because in its strongest form it is nearly right. Diane's two spendable totals, $506,000 Roth, about $526,000 traditional, really do sit within a few percentage points of each other. If the only thing that mattered were the dollar figure printed on the statement at 65, the choice would barely deserve a video. Two savers who accumulate identical balances would, on this reasoning, face identical retirements. The tax wrapper would be a preference, not a decision. But that is precisely where the single balance figure lies by omission. The number on the statement is a snapshot. Retirement is a 30-year process, and the process is where the two wrappers stop resembling each other. Start with what the government does to the traditional account, whether Diane wants the money or not. Under current law, required minimum distributions begin at age 73. The IRS compels a withdrawal from every pre-tax account each year, calculated from a life expectancy table, regardless of whether the retiree needs the cash. A large traditional balance does not sit quietly. It is forced out on a schedule, taxed as ordinary income, and lands on top of Social Security, potentially dragging more of that benefit into taxation too. The Roth has no lifetime RMD for the original owner. One account can be left alone, the other cannot. Now the trap: almost no calculator models. Consider Diane widowed at 78. The year her spouse dies, her tax status shifts from married filing jointly to single, and the single brackets are far narrower, the standard deduction roughly half. The same RMD that was comfortable across two jointly filed thresholds now compresses into one filer's steeper schedule. Vanguard's research group and multiple retirement income studies have documented this survivor effect. The surviving spouse routinely faces a higher effective rate on identical income purely from the filing status shift. The forced traditional withdrawal that cost 12% while married can cost several points more alone. The balance did not change. The tax on it jumped. Against that, the Roth offers a lever the traditional account structurally cannot: control over timing. Because Roth withdrawals are not taxable events and carry no RMD requirement, the retiree decides which year each dollar comes out. In a year of high medical costs, a Roth draw does not spike her bracket. In a year she wants to stay under a Medicare premium threshold, the income-related surcharges that kick in at specific figures, the Roth lets her fill the gap without generating a taxable dollar. Sequence of withdrawal flexibility is not a slogan. It is the ability to place income in the years it costs least and skip it in the years it costs most. So the Steelman was correct about the snapshot and wrong about the movie. At 65 on paper, the two accounts are close. Across the 25 years that follow, the traditional account carries a mandatory withdrawal schedule, a survivor bracket exposure, and a rigidity the balance figure hides entirely. The Roth carries none of them. Two savers with the same number on the same day do not face the same retirement. Which reframes the entire comparison. The dollar gap at 65 was never the whole answer. It was the part a calculator could print. The part it could not print is where a larger balance quietly leaves you poorer, forced out at the wrong time, taxed at a widow's rate, with no lever to move the income to a cheaper year. Two savers can walk into 65 with identical balances and walk out facing wildly different tax bills. Reverse the saver, and the case reverses with her. Everything so far has bent toward the Roth, the reversion, the deduction, the widow's bracket trap. But there is a person for whom the traditional 401k still wins cleanly, and pretending otherwise would be the same sin the old rule committed, freezing one set of inputs and calling it universal. Meet the counterexample. Call him Marcus. He is 58, married, 2 years from retiring, and he earns $310,000 a year as a partner at a firm in California, a state whose top marginal income tax rate reaches into the double digits and stacks on top of the federal schedule. His federal marginal bracket in 2025 is 35%. Add California's marginal rate on his top slice of income, and the combined rate on his last dollars earned pushes past 45%. That is the rate every additional Roth contribution would be taxed at, today, in full, with no deduction. Now look at his retirement. Marcus plans to leave California. He and his spouse intend to spend retirement in a state with no income tax, a documented pattern among high earners near retirement and a legal one. Their retirement income will be a fraction of his partner's draw, perhaps $120,000 a year from withdrawals and Social Security, filed jointly, in a state that taxes none of it, and at a federal bracket that lands around 22% after the standard deduction does its work. Line the two rates up. Marcus defers today at a combined rate north of 45%. He withdraws tomorrow at an effective rate closer to 15% once you blend the sheltered slice, the low federal bracket, and the zero state tax. That spread, 30 points, is enormous. It is the exact free lunch the 1988 plant supervisor enjoyed, except larger, because Marcus's working bracket is genuinely high and his retirement bracket is genuinely low. Every dollar he defers escapes a 45% tax to meet a 15% one. The traditional 401k does not just win for Marcus. It wins by a margin. No Roth advantage, no flexibility, no RMD relief can close. And notice why the machinery that punished Diane rewards him. Diane deferred against an artificially low 22% bracket scheduled to rise. Marcus defers against a 45% combined rate that is already at the top and cannot practically climb higher for him. Diane had no pension and no bracket drop to look forward to. Marcus manufactures his own bracket drop by earning at a peak he will never see again and relocating to a state that levies nothing. The survivor trap still exists for him, but a 30-point deferral spread absorbs a survivor's few extra points and keeps winning. Sit with what this does to the whole argument. The temptation after watching the Roth close the gap is to walk away with a new slogan, Roth always. That would be the old error in fresh clothing. Marcus is proof that the honest answer was never a slogan. It was a comparison. His working rate against his retirement rate. The very comparison the original rule asked for. The rule's logic was never broken. Its inputs were mispriced for the median saver, whose working bracket is low and whose retirement bracket is uncertain and possibly higher. For a high earner in a high-tax state relocating to a low-tax one, the inputs still line up exactly the way the rule assumes, and deferral is close to a mathematical certainty. That is where a bigger balance stops leaving you poorer and starts leaving you richer, because the tax on the way out is genuinely durably lower than the tax you skipped on the way in. The condition is not a mystery, it is a rate spread you can measure before you contribute $1. So the answer is not Roth always, it is conditional, and the conditions are knowable. Sit in on any onboarding meeting at a mid-sized employer and you can watch the mistake happen in real time. A new hire opens the enrollment portal. There is a contribution percentage to set and a checkbox, traditional or Roth. The default, in most plans, is traditional. The hire glances at it, decides not to overthink a form on day one, and leaves the default alone. The bracket comparison the whole industry recites was never even run. It was skipped by inertia. That is the first population still misapplying the rule, not by getting the math wrong, but by never reaching the math at all. Vanguard's plan data has for years shown the overwhelming majority of 401k contributions flowing into traditional accounts, and a large share of that is default behavior rather than deliberate choice. Millions of median earners in low brackets, exactly the savers the reversion works against, are deferring pre-tax by accident. The insight underneath the observation is uncomfortable. The old rule does not fail only when it is applied badly. It fails silently, because the machinery it lives inside is built to run it automatically. Watch the mechanism. A default is not a recommendation, it is an architecture. The plan sponsor picks traditional because it lowers taxable wages today and looks generous to the employee's current paycheck. The payroll system routes the money. The record keeper reports a fat pre-tax balance. Nothing in that pipeline is designed to ask whether the saver's working bracket is historically low, whether it is scheduled to rise in 2026, or whether her retirement income will even land in a lower band. The pipeline optimizes for today's take-home pay, and it calls that optimization a choice. Now widen it, because the defaulters are only the first layer. The second layer is worse, because these people did the work. They read the brochure, they took the sentence seriously, and they applied it faithfully, comparing today's bracket to an assumed lower one, concluding defer, and feeling responsible for having thought it through. Their diligence is exactly what traps them. They ran the rule with its 1990s inputs frozen in place, a small deduction, a pension underneath, brackets that stay put. They arrive at the confident answer precisely because they never checked whether the inputs still hold. The reward for following the rule carefully is being wrong with conviction. And there is a third layer, the one the forum threads are made of. The saver who has advanced past the rule to a genuine spreadsheet, modeling marginal rates to the decimal, arguing the difference between a 12 and 15% retirement bracket, and who is doing all of it before capturing the full employer match. He has the most sophisticated tax model on the thread and is forfeiting a 50% instantaneous return while he refines it. The precision is real. It is aimed at the small lever. Line the three layers up and something clarifies. The defaulter who never chose. The diligent saver who chose with expired inputs. The optimizer who chose the small question first. None of them made an arithmetic error you could circle in red. Every one of them made a sequencing error. They let the account type debate. The interesting, arguable, tribal question. Run before the questions that actually move the dollars. Capture the match. Check whether your working bracket is real or artificially low, and only then decide the wrapper. That is the step almost nobody gets wrong on the calculator and almost everybody gets wrong in practice. The mistake is not the tax math. The mistake is the order in which the decision is made. Think of the decision as a set of locks arranged in sequence, each one built to open only after the one before it. Try to force the third lock before the first two have turned and the whole mechanism jams. You spend your energy on the intricate final tumbler while the front door stands unopened behind you. The order is not decoration, it is the mechanism. So set the order down plainly, in the sequence the arithmetic rewards rather than the sequence the debate prefers. First lock, capture the match in full. Before a single word about traditional versus Roth is spoken, contribute enough to your workplace plan to collect every matched dollar your employer offers. This is not a tax decision, it is a 50% instantaneous return that neither account type can touch, and it sits upstream of the entire debate. A saver refining a bracket model, while leaving matched dollars on the table, has optimized the small lever and abandoned the large one. Turn this lock first every time, no exceptions. Second lock, read your own bracket path, not the phantoms. Ask two questions the old rule never asks. Is your current working bracket genuinely high, or is it a historically low rate scheduled to revert after December 2025? And will your retirement income, drawn from your own accounts, with no pension underneath, plausibly land in a lower band, or a higher one? For Diane, at 22% with brackets set to rise and no pension coming, the answer tilts Roth. For Marcus, deferring against a combined rate past 45% and relocating to a no-tax state, the answer tilts hard traditional. Same rule, opposite conclusions because the inputs differ. Run your inputs, not the brochures. Third lock, hedge what you cannot forecast. Tax law 30 years out is not knowable. The 2026 reversion is scheduled, but Congress rewrites schedules. The honest response to genuine uncertainty is not a bolder bet in one direction. It is diversification across tax treatments. Holding both a pre-tax and a Roth balance gives the retiree a lever the single wrapper saver never has. The ability to choose, year by year, which account to draw from, to stay under a Medicare surcharge threshold, to soften the widow's bracket compression, to place income in the years it costs least. A retiree with both buckets is not guessing about future rates. She is positioned to respond to whatever they turn out to be. Now step back from the locks and see what the sequence actually protects against. Every population still misapplying the old rule, failed at ordering, not at math. The defaulter never reached the second lock because inertia held him at the first. The diligent saver ran the second lock with expired inputs and never questioned them. The forum optimizer ran the second and third locks with precision while the first stood open behind him. None of them made an error you could circle in red. Each made a sequencing error, the interesting question answered before the large one. That is the quiet lesson under all of it. Wealth decisions are rarely lost on the hard calculation. They are lost on the order in which the calculations are attempted. The bracket comparison is the tumbler everyone wants to pick because it is clever and it has a satisfying answer. But it is the third lock, not the first, and forcing it early is how careful people arrive at confident, expensive mistakes. Fix the order and something clarifies. Match first, bracket path second, diversification and RMD hedging third. Follow that sequence and most of the ways this decision goes wrong simply close off before they open. Which leaves exactly one variable still live, the one the whole sequence hands back to you, not the account, not the order. Your own bracket path, now and later, is the only number left to resolve. So which account leaves Diane richer at 65? The traditional 401k the brochure points to, or the Roth it treats as a lifestyle preference? Hold the numbers in view before answering, because the temptation now is to reach for a slogan, and a slogan is exactly what got the median saver here. The snapshot said the traditional path won by a whisker, Roth spendable at 65, about $506,000. Traditional spendable across both pots after the tax collector is paid, roughly $526,000, $20,000, and the old rule takes its bow. But that $20,000 lead was built on a single load-bearing assumption that Diane's retirement effective rate lands low, at 12 to 15%, exactly where the rule assumes it always does. Pull that assumption and watch what happens. She deferred at 22%, a rate scheduled to revert toward 25% after December 2025. Her balance is large enough that required withdrawals at 73 push past the sheltered slice. And if she is widowed at 78, the survivor's filing shift compresses that same income into single brackets with half the deduction. Move her retirement effective rate up just 3 or 4 points, the direction every dated change pushes it, and the thin $526,000 lead does not merely shrink. It inverts. The Roth's $506,000 fully spendable, with no forced withdrawal and no widow's rate exposure, quietly becomes the larger number in the years that matter. Here is the relief, because the answer is not another tribal flag to plant. For Diane, median income, historically low bracket set to rise, no pension, retirement income drawn entirely from her own accounts. The Roth leaves her richer at 65 once you price in the reversion, the RMD schedule, and the survivor trap. For Marcus, deferring against a combined rate past 45% and relocating to a no-tax state, the traditional 401k leaves him richer by a margin no flexibility can close. Same rule, opposite verdicts. The rule's logic was never broken. And that is the revelation the whole video has been circling. The honest answer changed. Not because the arithmetic of deferral changed, but because the inputs it depends on moved out from under the median saver on dates you can look up. The 1988 plant supervisor had a high working bracket, a small deduction, and a pension that mechanically produced a lower retirement income. Deferral was a near automatic win, and the rule faithfully described that win. Diane inherited the same sentence with none of the same inputs. Her working bracket is low and scheduled to rise. Her standard deduction is 3 times larger. Her pension does not exist. The map stayed elegant while the territory disappeared. The account that leaves you richer is the one you deferred against at the higher rate. For a generation of high earners with pensions, that was reliably the traditional account. For the median saver today, contributing at an artificially low bracket with no pension underneath, it has quietly become the Roth, and the old rule, frozen at its 1990s inputs, points the wrong way for the very people still reciting it. Which hands the decision back to you, stripped of the slogan, capture the match first. Read your own bracket path second. Your real rate now against your plausible rate later, not the phantoms. Diversify across tax treatments where the future refuses to be forecast. Run those in order, and most of the ways this goes wrong close off before they open. The number that decides it is not in a brochure. It is your own bracket, now and later. This is education, not personalized advice. Wealth is built to last.